Imagine that your whole life you trust in the wrong people, while the one who really is by your side is someone who cannot say a single word. Beatriz, a woman who seemed to have everything, wealth, power, and status, barely knew her true salvation would come from a small pincher named Lulu, a survivor of abuse. She carried, just like her, invisible marks. In the midst of a world of betrayal, distrust, and false friendships, Beatriz discovers that genuine loyalty is where she least expected. And while she and Lulu face scars from the past together, they will learn the greatest lesson of their lives: sometimes silence reveals more truths than any word. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming and emotion that you won't want to miss. Beatriz was used to the rush of her daily life. As the CEO of a luxury car dealership empire, she spent her days at dazzling events and meetings filled with power-hungry businessmen and polished socialites. However, no one ever saw the loneliness hidden behind her perfectly styled hair and tailored designer clothes. Beneath her confident exterior, there was a hollowness she couldn't explain, a feeling she'd buried under years of corporate success and extravagant purchases. She had everything she could want, or so she thought. One evening, on her way to a gala, Beatriz decided to take a detour to her office. Her car, a sleek sports model, glided through the empty parking lot. As she turned into a parking space, she felt a sudden jolt under her wheels. Panic seized her. Jumping out of the car, she saw a small, frail dog lying on the ground, its tiny body trembling, eyes wide with fear. It was a pincher, its ribs visible through its thin coat, and scars ran along its back and paws. Despite his vulnerability, there was a spark of defiance in his eyes, as if he'd endured horrors but wasn't ready to surrender just yet. Beatriz's first instinct was to leave. She was already running late, and this wasn't her responsibility. But something about the dog's gaze held her there, a flicker of something strangely familiar. She called her assistant, asking them to cancel her evening plans, then wrapped the pincher in her scarf, lifting him gently. She whispered soothing words as she took him to an emergency vet. The vet said he'd survive but needed rest and care. As she filled out the paperwork, she realized she didn't want to hand him over to anyone else. Maybe, she thought, he needed her as much as she needed him. Beatriz brought the dog home, naming him Lulu. She had no idea how to care for a pet, but she'd figure it out. There was an unspoken understanding between them: he would help her find something she'd been missing, and she would protect him from whatever haunted his past. Lulu was about to become much more than a mere companion. What she didn't know yet was that he would open doors she'd long kept shut, leading her down a path to confront her own painful truths. Settling Lulu into her high-rise apartment was more challenging than Beatriz expected. The dog was timid, flinching at every sound and curling up defensively whenever she reached out a hand. Beatriz quickly learned that Lulu's trauma was deep-rooted. He'd clearly suffered a level of abuse she could barely comprehend. At first, his behavior frustrated her. She was used to control, to things working efficiently and people responding to her orders. But Lulu was different. He needed patience, something Beatriz rarely extended to others. In those first days, Lulu avoided her gaze, eating only when she left the room and hiding under furniture at the slightest movement. Every time he tensed up, a pang of sadness hit Beatriz. She, too, knew what it was like to feel trapped. Although her gilded cage looked different, her life felt just as confined as Lulu's. Over time, this small, scared dog became a mirror, reflecting back her own wounds, ones she'd worked so hard to cover up with status and wealth. Gradually, she adapted her routine around him, sitting on the floor near his bed, speaking to him softly, sometimes sharing her own secrets. She told him about the late nights in the office, the boardroom battles, and the loneliness she felt, even when surrounded by people who claimed to care about her. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, she confided in Lulu as she never had with anyone. "It's like they only see what I can do for them, not who I am," she whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. Over time, Lulu began responding to her. He would slowly edge closer to her, and though he still flinched at sudden movements, he seemed to recognize her voice as a source of comfort. One day, he let her touch his head without pulling away, resting his tiny face in her palm. It was a small victory, but one that filled Beatrice with an unfamiliar warmth. She realized she wasn't just healing him, he was healing her, too, in ways she hadn't anticipated. Beatrice was starting to understand that sometimes, the strongest connections came from shared scars, and both of them had plenty. Lulu's presence became a fixture in Beatrice's life, offering an unexpected comfort in her quiet apartment. She began to appreciate the silence they shared. It was unlike any relationship she'd ever known. Lulu's quiet companionship required no explanations, no performances, and no masks. She didn't have to prove her strength or put on a show of confidence. With him, she could simply be. As days passed, Beatrice noticed that her apartment was no longer just a place to sleep, it felt like a sanctuary. She developed small routines with Lulu, sitting beside him as she read, allowing him to drift closer, little by little, each day. Though still skittish, Lulu had started following her around the apartment, keeping a safe distance but observing her every move. In moments when she sat on the couch after long, exhausting days, Lulu would timidly settle near her feet, his small body curling into a tight ball. It was in these moments of silence that Beatrice found herself more open than ever before. She began talking to Lulu, her voice low and steady. She shared stories from her childhood, her rise in the business world, and the loneliness she'd felt after the loss of her parents, her only real family. She even confessed fears that had haunted her for years, fears of betrayal, of abandonment, of the empty love her friends seemed to offer. Each night, she unraveled a little more of herself, finding relief in the idea that Lulu was there, listening, without judgment or expectation. One evening, however, their silence was interrupted by the arrival of her friends. It was a casual gathering, something Beatrice felt obligated to host. She and her friends had formed a social circle that was mostly maintained by shared appearances, lavish dinners, and glamorous vacations. But as she poured wine and prepared appetizers, Beatrice noticed Lulu's strange reaction. Normally timid and cautious, he was unusually agitated, pacing near her legs and growling softly every time one of her friends approached. At first, Beatrice brushed it off, thinking Lulu was simply scared of strangers. But as the evening went on, his tension only escalated, especially around a friend named Vanessa. He would curl his lips, growl quietly, and shrink back each time she reached out to him. When Vanessa commented, "He's such an odd little thing, isn't he?" Not exactly friendly, a strange feeling stirred in Beatrice. Lulu's instincts seemed almost protective, as if he sensed something about these people that Beatrice had overlooked for years. As the night wound down, her friends left, laughing and complimenting her as always. But Lulu's behavior had planted a seed of doubt. He, a creature who had learned to be wary of others, saw something she couldn't yet see. What was it that Lulu sensed? Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling, and as she closed the door behind them, a sense of unease lingered in the air. That night, Lulu settled beside her bed, keeping a vigilant watch, as if guarding her from something yet unseen. In the days following the gathering, Beatrice couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had settled in her chest. Lulu's reaction to her friends continued to replay in her mind, especially the look in his eyes whenever Vanessa was near. Lulu, whom she had come to trust deeply, had responded to them with fear and distrust, a stark contrast to the bond they'd begun to form. Beatrice had always prided herself on her ability to judge people, but now, a tiny seed of doubt took root, challenging everything she thought she knew. Curiosity got the better of her. She started paying closer attention to her friends, noticing small details she'd previously ignored, the way Vanessa's gaze lingered on her office keys, or how Marina, another close friend, subtly probed her about her finances. It was unsettling, and yet Beatrice found herself caught in the web of her own doubts, wondering if she was merely imagining things. Then one afternoon, as she sat reviewing contracts in her office, Lulu padded up to her, carrying a crumpled piece of paper in his tiny jaws. Beatrice frowned, taking it from him. She hadn't noticed anything unusual, but the paper seemed out of place, as if it had been hidden away. Unfolding it, her heart dropped as she recognized handwriting, notes scrawled with details about her business, her finances, her upcoming deals, information she hadn't shared with anyone outside her closest circle. The betrayal was evident. It dawned on her that her friends had been gathering information, piecing together her vulnerabilities, perhaps even planning to exploit her position. A chill ran through her as she realized how naive she'd been, trusting people who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone. Her heart ached, not just from the betrayal but from the hollow feeling of knowing that she'd willingly let these people into her life, believing they valued her for more than her wealth. Lulu had sensed it long before she had, guiding her to see the darkness she'd ignored. She felt a wave of gratitude toward him, recognizing the loyalty he'd shown her, even as those closest to her plotted behind her back. That night, Beatrice sat with Lulu in her arms, tears slipping down her face as she whispered, "You're the only friend I truly have, aren't you?" Lulu nestled closer, offering a silent promise of loyalty that she knew would never waver. And in that moment, Beatrice vowed to shield herself, trusting only those who truly saw her, not her wealth, not her power, but her. In the days following her discovery, Beatrice's trust in her friends unraveled. She withdrew from social gatherings and limited her responses to their messages, all while pretending everything was normal. But within, suspicion festered. She'd been deceived, taken advantage of by the very people she had welcomed into her most private spaces. Each thought brought back painful memories of dinners shared, whispered secrets, and late-night phone calls, moments she now realized were carefully curated to draw out her vulnerabilities. Beatrice spent hours replaying her recent encounters with Vanessa, Marina, and others. At every dinner or event, they'd taken subtle opportunities to ask about her business plans, her personal life, and her aspirations, skillfully veiling their motives. She recalled a comment Vanessa had made about wanting a more significant role in Beatrice's company. Vanessa had been coy, suggesting she could help out with investments. What she'd presented as support now appeared sinister, a move meant to gain insider access to her financial empire. One evening, as she combed through paperwork in her study, Lulu entered, his delicate frame carrying a small crumpled piece of paper. He dropped it by her side, his ears perked as if sensing her apprehension. Curious, Beatrice unfolded the paper, finding a note addressed to Vanessa. Its contents made her heart pound, detailed strategies about her next business expansion, confidential numbers, and estimated revenue projections. The handwriting was unmistakable, hers. Someone had copied her notes, planting them as evidence of betrayal. Suddenly, it all fell into place. Vanessa and the others had infiltrated her life not out of friendship, but ambition. They'd slowly and strategically extracted information, exploiting her trust for their gain. Beatrice could practically hear Vanessa's hollow laugh echoing in her mind, their friendship now revealed as nothing but a facade for manipulation. A mixture of anger and heartbreak consumed her. She realized she'd been naive to believe she could share her life so openly. Lulu nudged her hand, sensing her distress, his dark eyes reflecting a steady, unbreakable loyalty. Beatrice held him close, her heart heavy but her mind resolute. From this point forward, she would protect herself, guarding her life like a fortress. And she vowed never to let anyone close enough to harm her again, except for Lulu, her one true ally. As the days passed, Beatrice methodically severed ties with each of her friends, confronting them one by one. Her messages were brief and decisive, stripping away any illusion of continued friendship. Vanessa, predictably, denied everything, claiming innocence and even attempting to deflect the blame. Marina's response was a desperate attempt at reconciliation, but her words rang hollow, laced with a guilt she couldn't hide. With each severed tie, Beatrice felt a sense of liberation and sadness, a mixture of loss and relief. The finality of her decision left her isolated. Her once active social life was now eerily quiet, her phone reduced to messages from work and sparse calls from family. She'd lost people who had once seemed integral to her life, leaving an emptiness she hadn't anticipated. But in this solitude, Lulu became her sole companion, his silent presence a balm to her wounds. His resilience reminded her that love and loyalty could exist, even if it came from an unlikely source. One evening, Beatrice sat alone in her expansive living room, the silence pressing against her like a weight. She looked at the glittering cityscape beyond her window, thinking back on all she'd achieved, and all she'd lost in the process. Despite her success, the sacrifices had been high. She'd let her business, her reputation, and her ambition define her, forsaking genuine relationships. Now, sitting beside Lulu, she allowed herself to feel the emptiness she'd ignored for so long. Lulu seemed to understand her grief, his small head resting against her leg, his eyes fixed on hers with an understanding that defied words. His presence filled her with a strange comfort. Here was a creature who loved her without expectation or ulterior motives. Stroking his fur, Beatrice felt an unfamiliar vulnerability rise within her. In this quiet moment, Lulu had become her family, and she knew, deep down, that this small, scarred dog was the only one who'd stood by her, without fail. Over the following weeks, Lulu and Beatrice's bond grew into something more profound than she could have imagined. She no longer saw him as simply her pet, he was her confidant, her guardian, and the reminder that love didn't have to be conditional. In the mornings, she shared quiet moments with him on her balcony, sipping coffee as the sun rose over the city. Lulu would curl up beside her, his eyes half closed, as if savoring the peace they'd found together. Their bond was rooted in a mutual understanding of pain and healing. Lulu, though small and fragile, had survived immense trauma, yet he'd found it in himself to trust her. His journey was one of quiet courage, and Beatrice admired him for it. Watching him confront his fears had shown her that trust and healing were possible, even for those who'd been deeply hurt. Encouraged by Lulu's resilience, Beatrice began to open up in ways she hadn't before. She allowed herself to be vulnerable, recognizing that her strength didn't lie in her power or her wealth, but in her ability to rebuild herself. She found herself laughing at little things Lulu did, like his playful attempts to chase pigeons off the balcony. She saw a new side of herself, someone softer, more present, and more in tune with the world around her. Their quiet companionship transformed her, teaching her the value of loyalty and love in its purest form. In Lulu's unwavering presence, she found a sense of security she'd never known, a reassurance that, no matter what came, they would face it together. For the first time, Beatrice felt a joy that wasn't dependent on status, wealth, or power. It was the simple joy of knowing she wasn't alone. Lulu's courage inspired Beatrice to reconnect with a part of her life she'd neglected, her estranged sister, Clara. Their relationship had been fraught with misunderstandings and unspoken grievances, yet the memories of their shared childhood were too precious to let go. Lulu had shown Beatrice that healing was possible, and perhaps it was time to apply that lesson to her own family. She reached out to Clara, arranging a lunch at a small cafe they'd frequented in their youth. When they met, Beatrice felt a mix of anxiety and nostalgia. Clara looked older, her face lined with the stress of years spent apart. Their conversation began cautiously, filled with small talk, but as the minutes passed, old memories surfaced. Laughter broke through their reservations as they reminisced, and slowly, a bridge began to form between them. Back home, Lulu observed her, his head tilted as if sensing the weight lifted from her. Beatrice realized that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, it was an act of strength. By confronting her past, she'd taken the first step toward rebuilding a bond that had once been precious to her. And she knew Lulu had given her the courage to face it. Their relationship was a testament to the transformative power of love and loyalty, and for the first time, Beatrice felt truly at peace. Distancing herself from toxic friendships allowed Beatrice to see her life with fresh clarity. She focused on meaningful connections, surrounding herself with people who valued her for who she was, not what she could offer. This change revitalized her business as well. She channeled her newfound purpose into creating a work culture grounded in respect, authenticity, and trust. Lulu, once a timid and fearful dog, now moved confidently through her home. He greeted visitors without hesitation, his demeanor calm and curious. His transformation mirrored Beatrice's own journey, each of them shedding old scars to embrace a life of authenticity. Their bond had evolved beyond companionship. Lulu had become a reflection of her growth, a reminder of the path they'd taken together. One evening, as Beatrice sat by the window with Lulu on her lap, she looked out at the city that had once seemed so daunting. Her world was smaller now, her circle of friends tighter, but filled with genuine connection. She felt content in a way she hadn't thought possible. She had found peace within herself, and she knew that, no matter what came next, she was finally ready. In the quiet comfort of her transformed life, Beatrice found a profound sense of peace. Her home, once a fortress of isolation, had become a sanctuary of warmth and love. Lulu, her constant companion, was the embodiment of loyalty and resilience, a silent reminder of the journey they had taken together. She had saved him, but he had saved her too, guiding her through pain, betrayal, and ultimately, healing. Sitting with Lulu on her lap one evening, Beatrice looked back on the events that had brought them together. She remembered the day she'd found him, broken and alone, and realized how far they'd both come. Their journey was a testament to the power of connection, trust, and the courage to confront one's own vulnerabilities. Lulu had taught her that strength wasn't about shielding oneself from pain, it was about embracing it, allowing it to shape and refine one's spirit. As they watched the city lights fade, Beatrice stroked Lulu's fur, a quiet smile on her lips. She was finally free from the betrayals, doubts, and loneliness that had once plagued her. And with Lulu by her side, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.